My guest today is Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, MD, PhD, professor of medicine at Stanford University, and co-host of the Illusion of Consensus podcast with Rav Arora. We discuss his ongoing lawsuit against the Biden administration in response to the American government's attempts to censor him, his experience as a target of government censorship, and the potential devastation and price controls on food proposed by the Kamala Harris campaign. Dr. Bhattacharya was an early dissenter against COVID-era restrictions and co-authored the Great Barrington Declaration. He's an expert in health policy and economics whose perspective is guided by years of practicing and teaching science at the highest levels. Stay tuned. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, thank you so much for joining me today. I have been looking forward to this conversation for a while now.
Oh, likewise. Thank you for having me on, Jason.
Oh, it's funny. I mentioned this before we started, but when I started doing this, everybody always rags on me because I wear a hat. Because if I don't, I look like a Mexican gangbanger. I'm in my bedroom. Everybody always rags on me. Hey, man, you need to get a studio. But I honestly never anticipated that yourself or Harvey Risch or any of the people that I've talked to would be willing to speak to me. So this is all kind of just out of the blue for me.
I mean, it's a great honor. I think it's very important for scientists to engage with people, not just with other scientists. A lot of the problems during the pandemic stem from scientists and public health people essentially holding themselves above and apart from regular people, ignoring the concerns of regular people. I mean, you and I are both regular people, so why would we not talk to each other?
Yeah, I mean, I often characterize myself as a guy stumbling around in the dark looking for a light switch. But yourself, I mean, you're a professor of medicine at Stanford University, PhD, MD. When you co-authored the Great Barrington Declaration, that was immediately, I was like, I have to follow this guy because you guys, yourself, Martin Kulldorff, and others, you guys stood up at a time where people in your position were, for lack of a better word, afraid to say anything. It seemed like there were a lot of doctors and scientists around the world who spotted the flaws in, COVID restrictions and vaccine mandates and other things, who weren't saying anything for fear of losing tenure or losing their jobs. And you guys went balls to the wall and put it all out there. And I mean, you really created the foundational document that a lot of dissenting doctors followed, in the months and years afterward.
I mean, it was, for me, it felt like an obligation. I have been publishing on infectious disease policy basically for my entire career. At some point, it was from the HIV pandemic to swine flu in 2009. I've been publishing on these topics for a long time. And when the COVID pandemic hit, I did some of the early work trying to measure how widespread it was, and it became very clear to me from that scientific work and also from my experience that doing research in the area, that it was that the lockdown focused strategy we followed was going to fail, and it was going to hurt a lot of people. And so I, as someone in that position, I felt I had an obligation to speak up. I just didn't anticipate, I guess, early on, quite the vitriol that would be cast my way as a result of it.
Yeah, and so let's dig into that a little bit, because you were the target of a very specific target of some censorship that came down through Twitter at the request of the Biden administration, and you are currently a plaintiff in a lawsuit against the Biden administration, Murphy v. Missouri. And can you talk about the timeline of events that led to you launching the lawsuit and what the current status of that lawsuit is?
Sure. So that case actually started in August 2022. It was brought by the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's offices against the Biden administration. I had been working with the Missouri Attorney General's office on a variety of anti-lockdown, anti-mask mandate, anti-vaccine mandate cases. And so they knew about me and asked if I would be willing to submit a declaration or an affidavit documenting that ways that I thought I might have been suppressed, my speech might have been suppressed. The suppression started even before the Biden administration took hold. Right. So when we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, it was October 2020, and the declaration, as soon as we put it up on a web page, it sort of took off. It took a life of its own. Almost 1 million people signed it, tens of thousands of doctors and scientists. The Google actually demoted it almost immediately, right? So like in many countries, you couldn't even find it on the front page or the second page or even third page, just a whole list of hit pieces instead. The Facebook actually suppressed it. This is in October of 2020. I later found out that Martin Kulldorff, one of the co-authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, his account had been suppressed on Twitter in 2020 for posting that it was safe to open schools. But the real suppression just took off when Biden took office. And I'm telling you all this is what I've surmised from a lot of the discovery in the case. Not that I didn't know this in August of 2022. What happened was that the Biden administration effectively decided they were going to make it a matter of national policy, that they were going to go and suppress people's speech online if it contradicted their idea of what they thought what they thought was like true scientific discourse, especially if it contradicted their policies. And so I joined Twitter in August of 2021. For an academic, I had a lot of success on Twitter. It was, I thought at the time, almost 100,000 people or 200,000 people had signed on to my account. But it was really clear that like I wasn't reaching a much broader. The reason I joined Twitter wasn't like to get like to have a lot of followers. The reason I joined Twitter was I wanted to tell people that the lockdowns were hurting people. I wanted to tell people that the lockdowns were not successful. I wanted to tell people about Sweden and the experience in Sweden. I wanted to tell people about the harms of the lockdowns to the poor, to the vulnerable, to the working class. That was the primary reason I joined Twitter. And the Twitter community I sort of garnered, they're great folks, but they were like people who already understood my message. I wanted to reach people that hadn't heard it. There've been other elements of suppression that I'd seen online and elsewhere. And so I wrote an affidavit in support of this Missouri versus Biden case. We can explain why it's called Missouri versus Biden or Murphy versus Missouri in just a bit. But it was called Missouri versus Biden. It's still called that. I wrote an affidavit and we submitted it. Me, Martin Kulldorff, Aaron Kheriaty, who's a UC Irvine professor who'd been suppressed and actually fired from UC Irvine for his stance against the vaccine mandates there. And I submitted this declaration, and I looked into whether it was any private lawsuits against Twitter had any chance to succeed, and I figured, I'm not rich, and I don't have, like command a team of lawyers. I thought it wasn't going to work. But when a state attorney general's office says that they think that suppression is going on, I jumped at the chance to help participate and find out.
Oh, yeah. And so I want to talk about the Twitter component, because you were fortunate enough to have Elon Musk reach out to you and invite you to the Twitter headquarters when he took over. And you were able to actually view where you had been blacklisted internally. What was that moment like for you?
That was surreal. So August 2022, the Missouri and Louisiana attorney generals filed a case. We immediately gained discovery rights. Discovery means that we can go get emails that are private, but that pertain to the case. The court orders the federal government to release those, and we get the right to like depose people, like go bring them in. And so I'd already, even before the Twitter purchase, I'd seen evidence, emails from the White House to social media companies saying, censor these people, these ideas. Now when Elon bought Twitter, I think he started the process in spring of 2022. But then he backtracked and didn't want to do it because it was too expensive. And then the court actually forced him to go through with the original deal, $44 billion. Sometime in December 2022, I think, is when he bought Twitter. And one of the first things he did, to his eternal credit, is that he invited in a series of investigative reporters, independent investigative reporters, including a reporter named Barry Weiss, who is the proprietor of the Free Press, a new independent journal, incredibly successful, actually, really interesting to read. And she had gotten to know me a little bit during the pandemic previously. And so one of the first things she did when she had access to the internal databases of Twitter was look me up. And what she found was, in my account, there was a picture of me with my account, and it had like little notices at the bottom. And one of the notices was Trends Blacklist. Trends Blacklist. I had been placed on a blacklist at Twitter. She wrote this up. It garnered enormous national attention. I was, of course, shocked, but I kind of suspected it, but I didn't have any proof until I saw that Barry had found this thing. Right before Christmas, Elon Musk contacted me out of the blue. I'd never met him before, and he invited me to come up to Twitter headquarters. I met with him for an hour. I mean, he's a very, very interesting man. I joke that it's about 30-minute drive from my house, or 45-minute drive from my house. So I joked with him that this drive had cost him $44 billion, the most expensive drive I've ever taken in my life. And he said he wanted to. The reason he did it is because he wanted to. He thought that not having free speech is a civilizational threat. And I saw it's like maybe he could have bought. He told me he could have bought a Pacific Island for this money, and would have been much more relaxing. But I think his view is that in order for mankind to survive, we have to get to Mars and other outside the solar system. In order for that to happen, our civilization won't survive without free speech. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the way he views this investment. He let me go look with my own eyes at this database of Twitter users and look at my own case. And what I found was exactly what Barry had found. I'd been on a Twitter blacklist, and some of the Twitter engineers helped me figure this out. I had actually been placed on the blacklist the day I joined Twitter in August of 2021. And the only thing I really posted that day was the Great Barrington Declaration. Why did Twitter put me on a blacklist in 2021, early 2021? Other than if they were facing government pressure. So the Twitter, it was really striking. The Twitter files revelation then went on into some of the briefs that we filed in the Missouri versus Biden case that were heard where the case was heard is 2023. A lot of that evidence had been put into place, and it was shocked the judges that looked at it.
Wow. Yeah, if I recall, one of the judges in the lower courts said this was the worst violation of free speech they'd ever seen, or potentially in American history, right?
Yeah. So in July of 2023, the Judge Terry Dowdy in Louisiana ruled in our favor on a preliminary injunction. The preliminary injunction, what that means is that the case hasn't yet been heard in completeness, but that we had developed enough evidence that it was very likely we're going to win. And if we're going to win, and the allegation is that the Biden administration was violating our civil rights, our basic civil rights, like the right to free speech, any violation of that is allowing it to continue is wrong. And courts need to step in to protect people from that kind of violation of civil liberties. And so since we were likely to win, the preliminary injunction ordered the Biden administration to stop that kind of censorship activity, stop contacting social media for the purpose of coercing them, pressuring them, essentially forcing them to censor and take down speech that they didn't like. It was like July 4th, 2023. It was a great day, actually. July 4th is the American Independence Day. It was like a big, and that ruling, I think that was symbolic that he put it out on July 4th, 2023, because it sent a clear signal to the Biden administration that they needed to stop violating American free speech rights, to violating this fundamental civil liberty that is at the heart of the American Constitution.
Yeah, I mean, I've been harping on this forever, but America as an idea is intrinsic to freedom in the world, right? And myself being here in Canada, we are very close to the United States, but we are missing a few of the key components that you all have baked into your Constitution and your Bill of Rights. Our Charter of Rights and Freedoms doesn't necessarily guarantee free speech, right? And what happens in the United States directly impacts us. We are directly downstream socially and politically. A lot of the media that we're exposed to is American. And so therefore our federal government, whether they like it or not, generally has to follow behind the United States in whatever they're doing. So up here in Canada right now, we have Bill C-63 that's currently passing through our parliament, which is the online harms bill, which would effectively make hate speech a punishable crime by, sentence of life in prison, right? I mean, what we are doing right now, right here, could potentially put me in prison for the rest of my life. And that law is retroactive. So they could go back 20 years and find something that I said online that would be considered hateful, and I could spend the rest of my life in prison for that. And see, my view on this is that they're essentially not looking to put people in prison for life. What they're looking to do is tie you up in the system. I think what they're looking for is an avenue to sweep as many people into the system as possible, create a bottleneck, and you end up actually sitting in prison for life, waiting for a trial date that never arrives. The point is that Bill C-63, that online harms bill, can only exist if on the American end, that same level of violation is occurring to the population there. And so can we talk about, so your lawsuit passes through the lower courts, goes to the Supreme Court. What was the Supreme Court's decision on this?
Yeah, so I just really quickly on Bill C-63, I view it as a fundamentally tyrannical bill. I mean, the question is, who gets to define what's hate, right? I see a lot of hate from lots and lots of parties, a lot of people who say that they are that they're the loving ones, casting hate at people that they disagree with. The question is not whether hate is good or bad. The question is whether the government ought to have the right to define who is being hateful, when that kind of designation can be and is tremendously arbitrary. And then to attach that to such draconian penalties, what it'll do, Jason, is it'll freeze speech, right? And it'll be used to suppress criticism of the government.
Right. Absolutely.
Right.
And just to add to that really quickly, because this is where the waters get murky, right? What hate speech is, as it's presented, is it is subject to an ideological interpretation, right? So whatever political ideology is in power at the time, or whatever ideology the bureaucracy follows, is what determines what hate is. And exactly what you touched on is what makes all of this so unclear. And what bothers me is that people who are on the side of that ideology think that that law will never be used against them. But, say if you're on the left, if you're on the radical left and you hate Trump and you think he's a fascist, well, imagine if that law exists and a Trump figure comes into power and suddenly that ideological window shifts and now you're in the crosshairs, right? That's how these things tend to work, right?
I mean, I think ironically, a bill like C-63 will foment hate in Canada, because the ideas that generate the passions that would be designated as hate don't go away because you suppress them. They fester, and the division just deepens. It's not just a signal; it's a signal essentially of the end of a free society. If you have a law like that in the books that actually used against people, because the kind of speech that the proponents say that they want to get rid of, well, you don't get rid of the ideas. You just get rid of the open expression of the ideas in a way that can be prosecuted. And that what that then does is it undermines the open society. Right? It undermines the capacity for Canada to be free. You said another thing which I thought was really interesting, important, is the role of the United States in this, which I entirely agree with. If you had a United States government that was wholeheartedly in favor of free speech, the way the way it was through almost all of the Cold War, except in times of war, the way it traditionally has been, as it essentially would make it very difficult for our allies in the West and elsewhere to adopt these kinds of speech restrictions, because they would be subject to withering criticism by Americans. by the American government. And to the extent that those kinds of restrictions impinge on the speech of Americans, right? There are lots of Americans living in Canada, right? That if an American government says this is what we stand for, if you have one major power on earth embracing free speech, it's very difficult, almost impossible for all the other major powers, any other major power to say no to it, because Canadians can come to the United States and speak.
Absolutely, and there's also the matter of economic sanctions. Canada is very dependent on the United States for military backing, right? I mean, the Trudeau government.
But it wouldn't come to that, right? What would happen is the American government would talk to the Canadian government. We're good friends, brothers, really, and they would have, and an American government makes it clear that this is a tremendously high priority for America. And Canada, just remind Canada about its commitment to freedom of speech, to liberty. It's not, you all don't have a charter that actually is enforceable nowadays, but the words of the charter are quite great. I mean, quite explicit and clear, right? And the Canadian tradition is in freedom of speech, freedom, right? It's in dark times in the United States, Canada has been seen as a beacon of light.
That's right.
Beacon of freedom. So I think an American government that reminded Canada of its high ideals, its own high ideals, I think that would be enough. There wouldn't need sanctions. There wouldn't need to be. We're brothers, really. Sister countries, really. Although maybe it's not so popular to say it in Canada, but I mean, but just that's the reality. Like it's not. It's just. It's not like there's a real dividing line, in the sense of like commitment to these basic civil liberties, at least not in their ideals.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so let's talk about that ideal, because in your lawsuit against the Biden administration, which hasn't gotten enough publicity in my opinion, because I think this kind of goes to the core of it all. It recently went through the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court levied a decision. And what was the decision that they came to?
All right, I evaded that last question you had, but it was your fault, Jason. You had the C-63. Okay, so we won in the lower court in July 4th, 2023. Just to tell the story all the way through. I mean, for me, it really was an emotional moment. Like I'm an immigrant to the United States. I arrived when I was 4. My parents arrived. It was like 1971. Just a few years after that, I came from India. India declared a state of emergency. Essentially, there was pressure against the government of India, and I think really sort of inappropriately, the government of India under Indira Gandhi declared an emergency, suspended free speech rights, suspended the ability for rival politicians to compete on a level playing field. It looked, and I remember my family. I was young then, but my family was like quite shocked over this. I mean, India is a democracy. It's the world's largest democracy. To have this kind of state of emergency imposed, where basic civil liberties are taken away, was a shock to my family, and we were very relieved to be in the United States, where it could never happen. I never thought I'd see the day where those kinds of states of emergency would return. I mean, I looked with horror what happened in Canada during during I was like 2022, right? The truckers protests was met with Justin Trudeau declaring a state of emergency.
Yeah,
grabbing the bank accounts of the leaders of the truckers, essentially violating the civil rights at scale, to the applause of many Canadians. I was absolutely shocked. It reminded me of that 1975, I guess, the state of emergency in India. And it's just, so when that July 4th ruling came down in 2023, where the federal judge said what the Biden administration was doing is effectively instituting a ministry of truth. He quoted Orwell. Wow. It sent chills down my spine. Essentially, we'd been living in the COVID era in a place where free speech rights did not exist. The government could go and tell people and companies who and what to censor, and they would have to do it because they'll face recriminations. The Biden administration then appealed the preliminary injunction up to appeals court, and there was a 3-judge panel. They all looked at the evidence and they were absolutely shocked. They said this is among the worst violations of free speech in American history. They made an analogy to Al Capone, the Chicago gangster. Like the federal government is Al Capone. Al Capone would go to Chicago businesses and in order to gain, essentially extort money from them, he would threaten them. It's a nice business you got there. It'd be a shame if something would happen to it, right? That's exactly the kind of tactic that the federal government used against some of the social media companies, telling them who and what to censor. And they upheld the preliminary injunction. They modified it a little bit, but it was really effectively upheld, essentially telling the Biden administration to stop contacting social media companies for the purpose of censorship. And then there were these stories came out how this was sending a chill in the federal government that they were like didn't want to do this. But they were going to stop. It was very dangerous because now all kinds of dangerous ideas could spread on social media without check. The traditional media embraced the censorship. They opposed the Biden this restriction on the Biden administration's activities for censorship. The Supreme Court put a stay on that preliminary injunction, essentially restoring the ability of the Biden administration to continue to censor in the way that they had. And then finally in March, I think, of 2024, Supreme Court heard the case on the preliminary injunction. That's when the name of the case got changed to Murphy versus Missouri, because some arcane rules in the Supreme Court about who if the plaintiff goes first, and the Biden administration was the plaintiff appealing the preliminary injunction, so they are the plaintiff, not us. Whatever. That's why there's a Missouri versus Biden is the name of the case. Murphy versus Missouri is the name of the case that was held in front of the Supreme Court on the preliminary injunction.
Okay, but it also does, just to kind of interject here, it does kind of seem strange that they purposely stripped Biden's name as the defendant out of that lawsuit, or am I just thinking a little too conspiratorial?
I think they have arcane. I don't think it was intentional to do that. Okay. I think it was the arcane rules, like Murphy. The lower court had said that the Biden himself, because he's the president, can say whatever he wants, right? There's no restriction. He can go and threaten social media companies in public. That's his right as president, which is fine enough. I mean, he's like that. He has free speech rights too. Mm-hmm. The difference, so Murphy was the next defendant on the list. And so the Murphy, the reason why he's there is because he's the Surgeon General. And he had organized a campaign essentially to have people rat out misinformation online and send him what he would deem misinformation, although it turns out to be a lot of true things that were suppressed. So that's why his name was first.
Okay, fair enough.
Anyway, so the Supreme Court heard the case and in June ruled against us 6-3. And the majority was very explicit. They didn't say that there wasn't censorship. In fact, they explicitly said that they didn't look at that. They didn't look at the evidence. They explicitly said they did not look up at the evidence of censorship. The one issue they looked at was something called standing. Now, standing, I mean, I'm not a lawyer and I knew very little about this, but it looks to me like it's a way for courts to get out of hearing fundamental issues. And the idea of standing is before you even hear the case itself, you have to ascertain whether the plaintiffs in the case actually have the right to sue, standing to sue. And the lower courts had looked at this. They'd said, look, the plaintiffs in the case, me, Missouri, Louisiana, and some of the other doctors in the case, the ideas that we were saying were very clearly suppressed, and it was also clear that we were suppressed by these social media companies. And it was so you put the two together. The Biden administration is pressuring social media companies to censor a whole bunch of ideas. Some of the ideas include the ideas that I put forward, like the idea that there's some immunity after COVID recovery. Right. Yeah. That idea gets suppressed, and I'm caught in the crosshairs because I'm posting ideas that the social media companies are now suppressing at the pressure of the Biden administration. I'm being suppressed. Just because a third party is involved in this suppression, this censorship, the social media companies, that doesn't obscure the fact, right, that it's the social media companies, it's the government that is suppressing me,
Right.
and millions of people like me. I'm in the case, but I'm actually just a representative of the millions of people that are suppressed. Jason, you were probably suppressed as well in the same way.
Oh, I was 100%. I still am, but yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, so and the point is that it's the government that is the initiating cause. You know, like if you play pool, the hitting the ball, the cue ball to start the chain reaction, right?
yeah.
They're the ones that are initiating cause for this. The Supreme Court put in a new rule, the majority of the Supreme Court, that it wasn't enough to say that with the emails that we had showing the government telling social media companies to suppress these ideas that they don't like. They said in order to have standing, you have to have an email that says suppress this individual person, and that and then when after all this stuff was revealed, the Biden administration swore up and down they would never censor again. So, and they argued that the censorship effort had ended, so there was no future harm.
Wow.
And so the Supreme Court made that as a rule, as a rule for determining standing. There has to be, you have to show evidence of future harm. And so, okay, so it was a 6-3 decision. The three justices that voted against, that voted in the minority, what they pointed out was that what they pointed out is that if you accept this standing ruling, essentially you have given the government a formula for how to censor people without the courts being able to suppress it.
Right.
All the government has to do is never mention a person in its demand for censorship. All it has to do is say, censor these ideas. These ideas are bad. We don't like them. If you allow them to be on your platforms, we're going to go after you. We're going to try to regulate you out of existence. And no one will ever have standing to sue. The government can do this without any, it's illegal. It violates the First Amendment still. It's just unenforceable because nobody will be able to go to a court and say, I would like to sue the government for suppressing my ideas in this way. And the court then will have to apply their four-pronged rule and say, well, you don't have an email showing that the government did this to you specifically, so you can't sue. Because the government will never again do that. What they'll do always is suppress ideas, not people.
That is just, I mean, it creates a precedence for extortion, right? I mean, that's essentially what that creates, right?
Well, I mean, it's a disaster for the American free speech in the United States, right? So it essentially now, okay. So I've painted this disaster. Let me temper it just a bit before I go back to more analysis about this. So, the case was over a preliminary injunction, not the case itself. So the case is now back down in the lower court, who's now trying to see if we actually do meet the standard of this four-pronged, free speech thing. We have plaintiffs where they're named by the government. They were named specifically for censorship by the government. So I think we meet the four-pronged test. We're trying to demonstrate that there's potential for future harm. I mean, that's actually not that hard. You have public officials openly embracing the censorship idea and arguing that you shouldn't, if we don't do it, it's going to be dangerous. So I think we will win the case itself, at least I hope, in the lower court, meeting the demands of the Biden administration, of the Supreme Court, of this four-pronged rule for standing. I think we'll win that, but I do agree with you that it's dangerous to have that as a rule.
Yeah.
I mean, a regular person they're not going to have the resources of the Missouri and a large state attorney general's office behind them when they sue. And so you can just get censored. Your ideas can get censored and you have no recourse. I think that is quite dangerous. But I do think that it's not so bad in the sense that if we win in the lower court again over the standing question, it'll go back up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will have to rule on the substance, which is does the government have the right to censor ideas online? Right, that they have to go in. So I haven't yet given up hope. I do think it's possible, but where things currently stand, it is a very dangerous place we are in the United States. The government essentially has free reign and a formula for censoring. There's another angle, which is there's a law that was passed in the U.S. House and is now being considered by the U.S. Senate that would explicitly make it illegal for the government to pressure social media companies to censor otherwise legal speech. And so there's I think there's at least two angles of hope on this going forward. But the Supreme Court made life much harder for folks who want free speech in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, infinitely harder, right? And the argument is always, well, what if somebody online is, what if there's neo-Nazi messaging, proliferating online? And my thought, I'm a free speech absolutist. My thought is always, you have to let all ideas out of the bag, right? And if you don't like an idea, then articulate an argument that exposes that idea as fraudulent, and then snuffs it out, right? And neo-Nazi ideas and things like that are very easy to attack. Like, it's not, most rational thinking people see stuff like that and immediately assume that the person who's saying that is an idiot. It's just what it is, right?
This is not even a hypothetical. This just recently. What's today? The 5th of September. There was a recent interview that Tucker Carlson did with some very radical historian,
Daryl Cooper. Yeah.
I mean, I'd never heard of him before, but he was making arguments that I mean, I'm not a historian, but like I've done a lot of reading about World War II history, and struck me as like completely, missing basic facts, essentially trying to blame Winston Churchill more than Hitler. He actually argued that Hitler wanted to make peace. A lot of stuff that historians have looked at this have seen evidence that were just not true. And what's happened is a whole bunch of really prominent historians have come back with excellent analyses. People like Victor Davis Hanson, people like Neil Ferguson here at Stanford have come back with excellent analyses demonstrating how this historian that Tucker Carlson was interviewing was wrong. That in fact, Hitler was, he explicitly wanted to kill Jews as a matter of policy.
Yes.
That he organized and very successfully did that. That his wars, his overtures for peace were false. He knew they were false at the time. They were lies in order to lull, to rebuild, or to lull people into so that he could like have the advantage later. I think that those kinds of like ideas that they pop up, they're not a danger if you allow people to respond to them.
That's right.
And people will. The real danger comes from the government suppressing ideas that it doesn't like, especially true ideas it doesn't like, because the government has the power to enact policy on the basis of those ideas. And if the people cannot push back in a reasonable way with speech, then those policies will come into place. And that's exactly what happened during COVID.
Oh, right? Absolutely. Yeah.
On topic after topic after topic, the government itself embraced misinformation. Mm-hmm. And then it suppressed the ability for the people to counter that misinformation in public spaces.
I think, sorry to cut you off, but I just want to say this because this has been at the forefront of my mind around all this. I don't think they anticipated Jay Bhattacharya. I don't think they thought that you would do what you did. I think what they miscalculated and underestimated was the courage of certain scientists and academics who were willing to lay their reputation on the line in order to say the truth. Because Brett Weinstein, I talked to Brett Weinstein about this, and he put this in my mind. The people inside the machine don't think the way we think, right? They have a different mentality. And so what they expect is that people like you will just fold in and go away, right? They don't understand our motivations. They don't understand my motivation for talking to you in my bedroom with a backwards hat on. They don't understand your motivation for writing the Great Barrington Declaration, for launching this lawsuit against the Biden administration. They don't hold the same values that you do. And I think that was what took the machine apart. And I think that's why what we're seeing with them dialing up the censorship now, I think that's the response to it.
I mean, I have to say, it was 2020 is a very difficult time for me. I mean, especially the beginning of the pandemic when I wasn't used to this kind of pressure, attacks on my family, death threats, vicious assaults on my integrity and character. And I knew personally that much of this was just all of it was just all lies. It was an attempt to try to get to silence me, but still was quite hard as friends effectively betrayed me, turned their back to me. My own institution where I am, I've been teaching here for almost 25 years, and I've been a professor. I've been at Stanford for almost 40 years. My own institution turned its back to me, and it was very, very hard. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, I lost 30 pounds of anxiety weight. It was it was very difficult, but like I had to decide what my career was for. Right. I've been studying, like I said, infectious disease policy, impacts on like the health of poor people, and the way that economic systems and government regulations impact the health of poor people. That's my career. I've been fairly successful in publishing in those areas, and the goal of my career for me always had been to help the lives of the people I study by understanding true things. Right. That's in my view, that's what a scholar is supposed to be. I mean, I'm not an advocate. I'm not in the sense of like, I'm not saying like you must follow me. My main goal as a scholar is try to understand. And I very firmly believe that a better understanding of the truth will actually ultimately help the people that I've been studying. That's been my motivation for my entire career. And so when I was looking at the data in 2020 about what the lockdowns were doing to the poorest people of the world, UN reports saying 100 million people were going to starve, or were already starved, not to death, but to the point of like dire straits, that hundreds of millions, 100 million children were going to go without school for years, essentially launching or accelerating a global divide in the haves and have-nots into the next century. Yeah. Where like we put poor families in such dire straits that they sold their children into sexual slavery or child labor. Right? That's what the lockdowns did to the poorest people of the world. And this is not just me. This is like UN reports that are documenting this in 2020. And I thought, this is such an immoral policy. And it's so obvious that it was going to have these impacts on the poorest people of the world. How can we adopt? And I decided I was willing to risk my own reputation and my career if I can speak for these people. And so that's why I did what I did. I don't know why there weren't more folks in academics. That it's actually a disappointment. But the ones that did speak up, I admire tremendously. Probably first among them are my colleagues in the Great Barrington Declaration, Sunetra Gupta and Martin Kulldorff. Both of them who've paid a heavy price. Martin actually ended up losing his job at Harvard ultimately. I think I don't know what you can do other than I believe in God very fundamentally, and I believe I'm here for a purpose, and the purpose is not self-aggrandizement. I'm here to serve others, and in whatever way I can. So that was really it. I had no choice, Jason.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what you did for me, because I'm just a guy, right? I'm a writer. I talk to really brilliant writers, and I always tell them they're the prized German shepherds. I'm just the stray dog chasing cars. That's what I do. But when you and a handful of others started speaking out, you guys affirmed in us something that we instinctually felt was wrong. And that was kind of the confusion of those early months, was that most people, if they're in tune with their instinctual voice, could feel that something was wrong, right? It just felt like there was something going on that we weren't being told. And when you stepped up, and Martin Kulldorff and Sunetra Gupta with the Great Barrington Declaration, and then people like Brett Weinstein jumped on board, and then Robert Malone came out, it was just kind of like, it was a slow validation of what average people, non-academics, could feel inside. And I think you guys were the ones who were responsible for taking down that machine. And that, again, going back to what I said earlier, like, I don't think they ever anticipated that was going to happen. I think that they thought that you would put your career above what you felt was right and correct, right?
I mean, I think a couple of things about that. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that they didn't. So like 4 days after we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, the head of the National Institute of Health wrote an email to Tony Fauci calling for a devastating takedown of the premises of the declaration. And that led to hit pieces and death threats against me. That when I saw that email, which was revealed by a FOIA, it absolutely shocked me, right? Such an abuse of power by the head of the NIH, a man who controls $45 billion of funding or more that makes or breaks the careers of basically every biomedical scientist in the country and actually even around the world. It was such an abuse of power. And why would he do that 4 days after we write it? I mean, I think what we did was we told the world that there wasn't a consensus in favor of the lockdowns, that there were a large number of scientists and doctors were quite convinced that they were a bad idea, that were hurting people and not protecting people against COVID. And so what we did is we shattered that the illusion that there was a consensus in favor of this policy. I have to say, though, just as a note, I think we lost the policy fight in 2020, in October of 2020. The lockdowns came back. Like we were really quite scared the lockdowns would come back in the winter of 2020, and they did. They came back. Yeah. The schools closed in many, many places. The fear mongering, the pressure, all of that came back. We actually didn't end up winning that policy fight. I wish we had.
Yeah, well, but in effect, what you all did was you exposed something very, very important for people who were outside of the bubble to see. And it was that, a lot of people, I think prior to 2020 traveled through life believing that maybe their government didn't care about them specifically, but they generally cared about their well-being. And what you all showed was that the bureaucracy really doesn't care. It really doesn't care about the health and well-being of the general population. And look, Denis Rancourt kind of got on me because I was talking about all of his accreditations and, him saying that titles don't matter. But in this circumstance, it does. You're a professor of medicine at Stanford University. You're not a guy in his bedroom doing, chemistry experiments, right? So that
I was once.
But, the fact that you were saying what you were saying lent a lot of credibility to that argument. Right. And, same goes for Robert Malone, Harvey Risch, right? Denis, even though he doesn't want to be held, in regard because of his title. But, your guys, the titles that you all held, Martin Kulldorff, were important in that argument, right?
I mean, I agree with Denis in that. I don't think the titles actually matter. What matters is, what am I saying is true, or can you is it replicable? Does it make sense? Is it consistent with logic and reason and data? I think those are the much more important things. But I think in the context of the fight over the public health policy of that time, it did matter. Actually, it did matter because what you had was public health authorities telling you to close your churches, close your schools, close your mosques and synagogues, close your businesses, stay isolated from each other, treat your fellow neighbor as biohazards. That's what public health was saying. And they were doing it on their own authority, not on the basis of actual verified data that it would protect anybody. And they were ignoring the obvious harms that would come of it. Collapse of economic systems, the inflation we face now, the starvation of hundreds of millions of people, because of the economic dislocations caused by the policies, from the supply chain disruptions and elsewhere and whatnot. They were ignoring those harms. They were asserting that these policies were going to protect people from COVID, and they ginned up. They made sure that people couldn't counter those things. They ginned up support for those policies by essentially suppressing people who oppose them, using censorship as a matter of policy.
Right.
And so in that case, essentially, the government is ruling by authority. They're not ruling by reason. They're not ruling by democratic right. They're ruling in a state of emergency, state of exception. And so it's appropriate for the other side who thinks that these policies were tremendously damaging to use its authority to the extent it has any against it. So I don't feel bad about that. Although I completely agree with Denis that it is not, as a general matter, we sort of give too much deference to professors in high places.
So while we're on the topic of Denis, I do want to ask you, because he recently released a massive excess death study. I believe they looked at 125 countries, and what they found was pretty astonishing in the data. Now, I want to apologize to Dr. Rancor right now before I talk about it, because I'm going to butcher it, and the next time I talk to him, he'll probably tear a strip off me. But the thing that really stood out to me was that what they were able to track was a rise and fall in excess deaths as pandemic measures were introduced. And they were able to drill down as far as looking at certain counties and states and different places in certain countries. And they were able to match a rise in excess deaths with news reports of different restrictions and different things that were coming, or different things that were instituted. And there's been a real concerted effort to kind of sweep that whole episode under the rug, right? Anthony Fauci and Peter Daszak and Francis Collins have all seemed to just evaporate. They seem to have disappeared from, public consciousness. But looking at that study that Dr. Rancor did with his team and talking to him, it really feels like this story is just starting. It's just beginning. Do you have a similar view? Are we just beginning to see the consequences of what went on here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the lockdown impacts will take place over a generation, right? So just to give one anecdote, a very large scale anecdote, Uganda closed its schools for 2 years. Most of those kids, tens of millions of kids, never went to school for 2 years. There was not Zoom school. Imagine that. Imagine your kids not going to school for 2 years. And then when they opened the schools up, 4.5 million of those kids never came back. Right. So they're gone. They're they will live their lives without that schooling. And just imagine, push forward a few years, what happens to their health and well-being as a result of skipping out on the such basic education? Well, we don't have to guess. We have the answer. There's a tremendous amount of scholarship around this. What happens is that those children will lead shorter, poorer, less healthy lives.
Oh.
They will lead shorter. I mean, and that's true everywhere where the school's closed. We're going to see a huge tidal wave of this kind of kind of like neglect. I mean, I think it's not that we can't do anything about it. We can try to make some remediation, which we should. That's very, very important to me. But the reality is that was a very predictable outcome of those school closure policies. As far as so I think the story is still unfolding over time. Like the inflation is a good example of this, right? The continuing inflationary pressure arose because we spent trillions of dollars trying to ameliorate some of the direct business harms of the lockdowns.
Yeah, and
it's the reality. We borrow trillions for that, and the inflation we're paying for it now. There's no such thing as a free lunch.
Of course not. And just to add to a lesser scale, I was teaching my 11-year-old son long division. I've ruined long division for him forever. He'll never know how to do it. So that's another consequence. But I do want to talk about the inflation, because you're a lifetime overachiever, Dr. Bhattacharya. You are also a PhD economist, and so I want to talk about the inflation. I know we're running out of time here, but I do want to touch on that subject, because here in Canada, the Trudeau government, with their coalition partner Jagmeet Singh, have been talking about price controls. And the story is always the same historically, right? It never ends. The greedy grocers are the ones who are responsible for artificially inflating food prices. Government's going to step down and bring those prices down. And then in the United States, Kamala Harris has been campaigning on price controls as well. And can you talk about price controls on a commodity like food, what that does to the supply?
Sure. Actually, can I just one more note on the question before, because I think
of course.
I thought of this, and on excess deaths, you can run complicated studies, but I just want to give you one data point, which I think is definitive. In the 3 years after the pandemic started, if you look at all-cause excess deaths in Europe and you compare Sweden, which had a you did not have a lockdown. It never closed schools for kids under 16. It had a much more sort of like reasonable traditional public health approach to the pandemic. Sweden has lower all-cause excess deaths than its neighbors, and all the rest of Europe.
Right.
Much of which lockdown, just compared to Germany is a good example of this. Much higher all-cause excess deaths in Germany than in Sweden. Compare Canada, right? Canada had a very, I call it draconian lockdown policies. And all-cause excess deaths in Canada from the 3 years after the start of the pandemic are higher than Sweden's. Right? So what the very least you can infer from that is that lockdowns were not a necessary policy in order to save human life or protect human life.
Right.
And that's the obvious reality, right? So if you are thinking that Sweden is somehow different, like Sweden has a safety net just like Canada does, right? As a national health system and so on, it's very comparable. Well, how did Canada have higher all-cause excess deaths with its lockdowns? If lockdowns are protective. Same thing you could do with California and Florida. Florida had lower age-adjusted all-cause excess deaths than California from the 3-4 years after the beginning of the pandemic. You don't need lockdowns to protect human life. I'm not saying don't do nothing. I'm saying that you don't need lockdowns to do it. You have other policies that would have done better, like policies like they were suggested in the Great Barrington Declaration. But then, what are the harms of the lockdowns? Let's talk about Sweden, about the price controls. The inflationary pressure from the overspending, that's just it's almost unimaginable that any economist would deny it. I don't think any serious economist denies it. Right? The way that the lockdowns were financed essentially was by printing money and by selling bonds. Right? And then what that did then is it injected money into the economy that was needed to protect people from the depredations of the lockdowns. Right, your business closed, you lose your work. The money from the government to finance that is a necessary thing, but that printing money drove inflation. It absolutely did. And so the high prices of the grocery pumps you're seeing now. Now, inflation is the change in prices over a particular period, right? So a positive inflation rate means the prices are going up during that period by that fraction, by that amount. Very high inflation means it's going up very rapidly. But any positive inflation rate means the prices are going up. And so, prices for groceries and for a whole host of things, like just expenditures out of pocket for regular people, are much higher, essentially to pay off the lockdown related expenditures we had earlier. And now for politicians, this is a major problem. They caused the inflation, right? They were the ones that pushed for the printing of money. And the prices high prices pose a tremendous political problem to politicians because nobody wants those high prices. And especially poor people, it hurts poor people because they live on fixed budgets. Mm-hmm. And so for politicians, rather than aiming at the root cause, which is the lockdown and then the printing of money to finance, they're looking around for almost any hokey policy to try to suppress, to like show that they care. Price controls are an example of this, right? What price controls do is not induce and make grocery bills lower. What they do is they induce shortages. Mm-hmm. Right? There's a fundamental real thing going on, which is that things are expensive thanks to the prices rising because of the inflation. Right? You don't address that problem by price controls. You address that problem by pro-growth policies to try to stimulate. You address those problems caused by price controls by safety nets that take care for people that are really poor, that are suffering from those high prices. Right? You have to address the actual root problem. You have to address some of the consequences for the least well off. And I think those policies would make a lot of sense. But instead, the price control is to try to foist off the blame of the inflation on like greedy grocers or something. It's absolutely despicable. Right? Regular people running small businesses are not to blame for the inflation. The poor people who are suffering the most from this inflation will not benefit from the price controls because there'll be shortages of goods that they otherwise would have access to. And they're not being helped by the inadequate safety nets that would normally help them. Right. So I think it's just a wrong-headed policy trying to scapegoat others for the really dumb policies that led to the problem in the first place.
Yeah. And I know you got to go, so this will be my last question, but we've seen the devastation that price controls do. I mean, Richard Nixon introduced price controls, and it wasn't even 6 months, and he had to pull them out because there were nationwide food and gasoline shortages. I mean, we saw the devastation that they caused in Venezuela when Chavez nationalized the food supply, introduced price controls, and basically locked the grocers out of that industry. And there are hundreds of other circumstances like this. I mean, you can go all the way back to the Soviet Union. So why are they reaching for this now? That's the part that confuses me, is that we have like a historical legacy of seeing exactly what these policies do. So why are they going for them now?
I mean, politically, it's easier to scapegoat people than to actually try to solve the problem. Right? The price controls allow politicians like Kamala Harris to scapegoat grocers. I mean, you know, they'll say, "Oh, the grocers are the reason why you are suffering." Why you have to pay such high prices. It has a long and sordid history behind it. You're absolutely right, and it never ends in good for the poorest or the least well off. So I think that's the short answer. It's so much easier to scapegoat rather than accept that you've caused this problem and then seek constructive ways to help address it.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Bhattacharya, I could talk to you for hours. I know you have classes to teach and things to do. I mean, you are battling the U.S. government after all, so I'm sure you have a full plate. Dr. Bhattacharya, hang around for 10 seconds when we're done here. We'll say goodbye privately. But for now, can you tell everybody where they can find you?
Sure. I'm weirdly active on Twitter. Dr. J. Bhattacharya, D-R-J, the letter J, Bhattacharya, Bhattacharya. And I have a podcast on Substack called The Illusion of Consensus with a journalist named Rav Arora from Canada, actually. So you can check me out in those places.
Yeah, and tell Rav to talk to me, man. He's from Vancouver too. He owes me.
Oh, he hasn't talked to you? You should definitely talk to
no,
him.
I'll reach out to him again. But listen, Dr. Bhattacharya, it was an honor to talk to you, man. I've been a fan of yours since the very beginning, and you guys. I don't think you guys really understand what you did for the world, and you guys laid it all on the line, and some of you lost a lot. You talked a little bit earlier about what you went through personally. And I just want you to know that it made a huge impact. And I think you all changed the world in a way that I don't think any of us will understand for another 20 to 30 years, but they're coming after free speech. Because you guys showed that what free speech is capable of doing. And I don't think we're going to lose it. I really don't. I don't think we're going to lose this fight. But I think the fight started because you guys wouldn't lay down and die. And I greatly appreciate you for that. Thank you.
Jason, thank you for your kind words. I also am quite optimistic. We will win. It's a strange place for us to be where
it's just
where we have to fight. Yeah.
It's the weirdest time. I mean, I'm a writer. I never wanted to sit in front of a camera. Like I said, I haven't invested in a studio yet just because I never anticipated any of this happening. But, I just thought, well, add my voice to the mix and hopefully somebody like Jay Bhattacharya will talk to me someday. And now here we are.
That's the nice thing about the pandemic. I get to meet all kinds of interesting people.
Well, that's awesome. Well, once again, Dr. Bhattacharya, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jason. You take care. Please call me Jay next time, though.
Okay, will do.